Ever feel like you're meant for something bigger? Like there's got to be more to life.
Oh, absolutely. That search for deeper meaning, it's universal, isn't it?
Totally. And today, we're exploring that idea through the lens of Jewish mysticism. We're diving into a concept called Tikkun Brit Hadshah.
Ah, now that's a juicy one. We're working with some teachings from Gaddi Efrayim. He's with Beit Yisrael International. And he connects this Tikkun Brit Hadshah directly to the creation story, like right back to Genesis, Bereishit Parsha.
Okay, so back to the very beginning. Love it. But before we go any further, gotta ask, what does Tikkun Brit Hadshah even mean? Break it down for us.
Sure. Each word is a piece of the puzzle. Tikkun, that's about spiritual repair, elevating ourselves, fixing what's broken inside. It's about aligning with a higher purpose.
So like a cosmic fixer-upper, but for our souls.
You got it. And then you've got Brit, which
Right.
means covenant.
Yeah.
Think about those agreements, those promises between God and figures like Abraham, Moses, these huge moments that shape Jewish history.
Right. This deep bond between humanity and the divine.
Exactly. And that brings us to the most interesting part, Hadshah, renewal, rededication, even the new.
Okay, I'm seeing it. So putting it all together, Tikkun Brit Hadshah, we're talking about mending and renewing this covenant, this connection with the divine, but in a fresh way.
That's the core of it. It suggests that we're not static beings, right? We're constantly evolving. Tikkun Brit Hadshah, it's this ongoing process of growth, change, and realigning with our truest selves.
Constantly striving to be better, not just for ourselves, but for something much larger.
Exactly. And this is where personal growth comes into play. It's a call to action, to look inward. What needs fixing within us? Where can we renew our commitment to what matters, to a more meaningful life?
Whoa, okay, so we're not just talking ancient philosophy here. It's a way of life, a path to transformation that's rooted in something so much bigger than ourselves.
And that's the power of Tikkun Brit Hadshah, right? It connects those ancient mystical traditions to our very modern search for purpose. It's timeless. It really makes you think. So before we go, let's bring it back to Beit Yisrael International. How does this organization embody these ideas, this connection to tradition and growth?
Yeah, they're all about connecting with the divine. Their mission statement actually describes them as serving the creator of heaven and earth who dwells between the cherubim.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Dwells between the cherubim.
Right, it's a powerful image straight from the heart of Jewish tradition. The cherubim, those angelic beings guarding the Ark of the Covenant, it emphasizes a direct, intimate connection with the divine.
I see. So it's not just about studying ancient texts, it's about experiencing that connection firsthand.
Exactly. And they draw on a rich tapestry of Jewish wisdom, Talmud, Midrash, Hasidic teachings, Kabbalah, the whole works.
So they're weaving together all these different threads of Jewish thought to understand this idea of Tikkun Brit Hadshah.
Precisely. It's about bringing together ancient wisdom and modern application. Fascinating. And it seems like Gaddi Efrayim, through his teachings, is guiding us on this journey of Tikkun Brit Hadshah, right? Using the story of creation as a framework.
Absolutely. And it's brilliant when you think about it. Genesis, it's the foundation, laying out the relationship between humanity and the Creator.
Right. It's like he's saying, if we want to understand our potential, our purpose, we have to go back to the source, to that original blueprint.
Precisely. And then by understanding Tikkun Brit Hadshah within that context, we can see our own lives as opportunities for growth, for change, for actively participating in this unfolding story.
It really leaves you with a lot to chew on, to really appreciate the light,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're diving into today, right?
Yeah.
This whole idea of the light of the Tzaddik.
Yeah.
And we're using these excerpts from Tikkun Brit Hadshah.
It's really interesting how this first comes darkness, then light thing. It's like everywhere in Jewish thought.
Totally.
Even in the creation story itself, right?
Okay, yeah. So how does that work again? Remind me.
So you've got the Torah, obviously, like the foundation of everything. And it talks about how the world starts as formless and void, like this total darkness.
Right.
Light's not just missing. It's like darkness is, the background that light shows up against.
So it's not just nothing, the darkness. It's like its own thing.
Exactly. And Rashi, the commentator, he takes it even further.
Okay.
He says darkness wasn't just an absence, but something positive, full of possibility. Like think of a seed under the ground.
Oh, okay.
It's in the dark that it sprouts and grows toward the light.
I like that. That's a good analogy. So then that's like our own lives. Those times we're lost.
Yeah.
Could be setting us up for growth, right? Like our own light.
Exactly. And that's where the Tzaddik, the righteous person, comes in.
Okay, so let's get to the Tzaddik. in what we're looking at, it describes them as like radiating divine light.
Right.
So what's that actually mean?
So in Jewish mysticism, a tzaddik isn't just good in the normal way we think of it. They're like a channel for God's presence.
A conduit for the light.
Yeah, exactly.
But how does that work practically? What does that light do?
Okay, imagine there are these sparks of divine energy scattered everywhere.
Okay.
And Kabbalah, that's the mystical tradition, it teaches that creation kind of scattered these sparks.
So like hidden bits of light inside everything.
Exactly. And the tzaddik's purpose is to gather up these sparks, bring them like closer to where they came from.
Wow. I really like that image. Okay, so if those sparks are everywhere, even in us,
Yes.
are we also able to, like, elevate them? Do we have a part in that?
Absolutely. Now, the tzaddik, they're at a different level spiritually, but they're also a model for the rest of us.
Right, right.
We've all got that divine spark. And learning about the tzaddik, it's like learning how to make our own light stronger.
That's pretty powerful when you think
Yeah.
about it. Okay, but if they're gathering those sparks, what do they use? Our text mentions the Torah, right? Like, that's important to how they bring light to the world.
Absolutely key point.
Hmm.
The Zohar, that's a major Kabbalah text, it describes the Torah as a tree of life and a source of light.
So it's not just
Yeah.
reading it, it's like
Okay.
living it, drawing from it to light the way for others.
Exactly. Their study, their actions, their teachings, all rooted in Torah.
Right.
It's like they unlock the Torah's wisdom,
Mm.
not just the words, but the like divine essence in them.
Wow. So they're like the Torah, embodied, radiating its wisdom and compassion. Okay, but how does that touch the world more broadly? It can't just be individual, right?
That's where it gets even more fascinating. We've got to look at two Kabbalistic ideas to get that. Nations and klipot.
Ooh, I love these mystical terms. Okay, break those down for me. What are they and how do they fit in? Okay, so nations and klipot, kind of like a mystical map, right?
Something like that. Think of nations as, all the different cultures, societies we have.
Right.
Each one has its own way of seeing things, its own way to connect with the divine.
So not about everyone following the exact same path, but more like each culture has a piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And the Tzaddik's teachings, which come from the Torah, they help each nation, each person, connect with that divine spark in a way that makes sense for them, finding the universal in the specific.
Okay, I'm starting to see how their influence goes beyond any one group, any one belief system, really. It's about those universal truths that connect us all. But what about klipot? That word sounds kind of intense.
Yeah, it's got some weight to it. It's often translated as husks or shells.
Shells, okay.
And they're like the forces of chaos, negativity, things that cloud our perception, block our spiritual growth, obstacles to that divine light shining through.
So if the sparks are our potential for good, the klipot are not helping.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they can show up in so many ways. Personal struggles, negative thoughts, even societal problems, injustice, anything hiding our true selves, our goodness, that can be klipot.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's a thought. If klipot are those negative forces, is there any hope for them? Can they change?
Now, that's a deep question. Gets right to the heart of the Tzaddik's mission. Here's the thing. Kabbalah says that even in those klipot, even in the negativity, there are sparks of holiness trapped inside.
Wait, really? So even in the worst stuff, they're still good. That's hopeful.
Right. Nothing's completely bad beyond saving. That's the idea. And the Tzaddik, that's where they're crucial. By who they are, what they teach, their actions, they can actually weaken the klipot and free those trapped sparks.
So it's like they're fighting darkness with light, bringing things back into balance.
Beautifully said. And that fight, that freeing of sparks from the klipot, that's all part of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world.
Right, Tikkun Olam. I've heard that before, but remind me, what's it mean here?
It's huge in Jewish mysticism. Simply put, it's working to heal the world.
Okay.
Make it more just, compassionate, whole. And it's not just for a few people. It's everyone's responsibility.
So even small acts of kindness, standing up for what's right, that all plays a part.
Exactly. Every time we choose compassion, act with integrity, fight for a better world, we're doing Tikkun Olam. Freeing those sparks, letting them make things brighter.
I love that. Makes it feel huge and personal at the same time, like we can each make a difference.
It really shows how powerful these ideas are,
Yeah.
They're a tzaddik, that luminous figure guiding us toward a better world. It's funny, when you think about it, this whole tzaddik thing, this righteous person shining their light, it's like what we were saying before. Got to have the darkness for the light to mean something.
It's true, isn't it? It's like by facing those klipa, all that chaos and bad stuff, the Tzaddik is living proof of that idea. They go into the darkness, but not to get lost, to free the good that's hidden there.
They show us that being truly good, truly righteous, it's not about pretending everything's perfect, right? It's about dealing with the world as it is, with all the hard parts, and letting something brighter come from that.
Exactly. And because they're so connected to the Torah, because they live by its teachings,
Right.
they show us that even in the darkest places, even in our struggles, those sparks of good are still there. Like that saying, the wound is where the light gets in. The Tzaddik, their whole life, it's like that. Yeah.
And what's amazing is, it's not just for them. They want others to find that light too. What they teach, what they do, just being who they are.
Yeah.
It guides us, encourages us to do our own part in Tikkun Olam, that fixing of the world. One good deed, one step towards justice.
Okay, listener, are you ready for this? We're diving deep, really deep into some fascinating territory. We're tackling the Jewish identity of Yeshua, and you probably know him better as Jesus.
Yeah, most people do.
But trust me, the source material here, it's going to turn a lot of what you think you know upside down.
Oh, it absolutely will. We're talking about a completely different lens here.
Exactly. Yeshua HaTzadik.
I have to admit, even I did a double take the first time I saw that.
Right. It sounds like something straight out of like an ancient scroll or something. So before we get lost in the weeds, but our text also talks about someone specific, right? Yeshua HaTzadik.
Yes, exactly. They connect him to this idea of Besorah HaTova Gila, the good news of redemption. Big concept in Jewish eschatology, the study of the end of days.
Right, right. Now, that name Yeshua can be kind of loaded, especially for people who aren't super familiar with Jewish thought.
Right.
So, got to be careful here. What's the text saying about him specifically within a Jewish context?
Totally. It's important to get that. In Jewish thought, Yeshua HaTzadik is seen as a righteous teacher.
Yeah.
Someone who really pushed for following the Torah and having that deep connection with God. His teachings, from a Jewish view, they're rooted in the Torah of Moses. They illuminate the deeper spiritual meanings there.
So not about seeing him as divine, but as a teacher who embodied those Tzaddik qualities we've been talking about.
Exactly. The text highlights how his teachings, especially about Besorah HaTova Gila, they fit with that idea of a Tzaddik bringing light and redemption. But it's all within that Jewish understanding that he was a teacher, a guide pointing towards the Torah and connecting with God.
This is so interesting. We've gone from these big ideas of light and darkness to this specific example of Yeshua HaTzadik. And it's all connected to Jewish mysticism tradition. Break it down for us. What's a tzaddik in plain English?
Okay, so Tzaddik in Judaism, it means righteous one. But it's not just like, hey, you're a righteous dude. It's a huge deal, like a title with serious weight. We're talking about someone who embodies the Torah, who lives and breathes those teachings,
So like a walking, talking example of Jewish law.
Exactly. They're deeply connected to God and guide others towards that connection. But, and this is a big but, a tzaddik never claims to be God.
So not divine in the way Jesus is usually portrayed.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes this, even going so far as to quote Yeshua himself from the Besorah al Pi Yesod, or what you might know as the Gospel of John.
Oh, getting biblical already. I love it.
Right. And listen to this. He says, for salvation is from the Jews.
Wow. Okay, so right there, that throws a wrench into any idea that Yeshua saw himself as separate from, let alone above, his own Jewish faith.
100%.
Yeah.
And this source, it takes that idea and runs with it.
Right.
It's like they're putting Yeshua firmly back within Jewish history and tradition, not as some outlier who broke away from it.
And that actually leads perfectly into my next question, because I swear, as I was reading this, my mind kept going, wait, is this source saying what I think it's saying? Because at one point, it connects this whole Yeshua HaTzadik idea to, wait for it, the Pharisees.
Yeah, they don't hold back, do they?
No, they do not. But also the Pharisees, like the Pharisees who are always shown as Yeshua's rivals.
Right.
Like constantly arguing with him.
Right. You see it in pretty much every depiction. But here's where context is, like everything.
Hit us with it.
So the Pharisees back then, they weren't just some random group of guys giving Yeshua a hard time. These were heavy hitters in Jewish life. They were all about studying and interpreting the Torah, like obsessed with it.
Okay, so serious scholars then, not just like self-righteous rule enforcers.
Exactly. And the source even pulls a quote from the Besorah al Pi Hadrash, the Gospel of Matthew, to back this up. In it, Yeshua himself acknowledges their authority, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, observe and do."
Sit In Moses' seat. That sounds important. Like, what does that even mean? Is it literal? Do they have, like, a designated chair or something?
Okay, so maybe not a literal chair, but in terms of symbolism, huge. It's about inheriting authority. Like, imagine getting the right to interpret and teach the Torah directly from Moses himself.
Wow, okay. Yeah, I'd listen to those guys, too.
Right, and that's exactly what Yeshua is saying. He's basically saying, these guys, they're carrying the torch of our tradition. They're the real deal. Listen to them.
So we're already seeing a totally different side of Yeshua here. He's not some rebel going against the grain. He's woven into this tradition, respecting its authority, and even, like, vouching for the Pharisees as legit teachers.
And just when you think it can't get any wilder,
Mm-hmm.
hold on tight. This source is about to take us into a cosmic battle between light and darkness, even going so far as to suggest Yeshua might be connected to Esau.
Whoa, 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 hold up. Esau. As in Jacob's brother, the one with, shall we say, a less than stellar reputation.
Right.
We're going full-on biblical epic here.
Yeah, we're about to wade into some deep, deep waters here, theologically speaking.
Deep end, no floaties, I'm here for it. But seriously, before we dive in, I think it's important to remind everyone, and myself included, that we're exploring this from a very specific perspective within Jewish thought. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're not saying this is the definitive interpretation, just one fascinating piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Totally get it. Okay, disclaimer over. Hit me with it. What's the deal with Yeshua and Esau?
Okay, so this is where the source gets super specific, and it's key to understanding this whole connection. It's not the historical Yeshua HaTzaddik, the righteous teacher, who's linked to Esau. They're talking about a different figure entirely, one tied to Edom.
Edom. Okay, remind me, who were the Edomites again?
They were the nation descended from Esau. And this other Jesus, for lack of a better term, this Jesus of Edom Esau, if you will, he represents the forces working against Jacob, against the light of Torah.
So it's like there's the real Yeshua, the Jewish teacher we've been talking about, and then this kind of like warped reflection, this Jesus of Edom who represents something else entirely.
You got it. The source makes this clear distinction because it's addressing a common thread in Jewish thought, which warns against a Jesus who wants to abolish the Torah, who causes harm to the Jewish people.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So they're not saying the real Yeshua, the Jewish teacher, is the problem. They're warning against this other figure, this Jesus of Edom, who's been twisted into something, well, frankly, pretty sinister.
Exactly. And this is where we start to see that cosmic battle playing out on a historical stage, right? You've got Jacob representing Israel and the light of Torah, and then you've got Esau, who represents the forces opposed to that light. And somehow Yeshua gets pulled into this struggle with two distinct versions of him emerging.
It's like something out of a movie. But if we're talking cosmic battles and forces of light versus darkness, we've got to bring in the concept of Tikkun Olam, right? It's all connected somehow, isn't it?
You know it, Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. It's such a powerful, hopeful idea. But it also feels like, well, a pretty massive undertaking, to say the least. How does this source connect Tikkun Olam to this whole cosmic battle in Yeshua's story?
Right. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, this is where we get a glimpse into a much bigger picture. The source suggests that even awful historical events, even the twisting of Yeshua's teachings and the suffering that resulted from that, it's all part of a huge divine plan.
Wait, so even the darkest, most tragic chapters are somehow part of a journey towards redemption?
That's the idea. It's a concept that pops up again and again in Jewish mysticism, this notion that the world is inherently imperfect, broken from the start. And humanity's role, especially the Jewish people, is to work towards healing those broken pieces, to bring the world closer to harmony with God's will.
I mean, that's beautiful and all, but it makes you wonder, if there's this divine plan, if God is ultimately orchestrating everything, where does our free will fit in? That's always been a tough one for me.
You and philosophers for centuries, my friend. But you're right. It's a question that naturally arises, and this source doesn't shy away from it.
Oh, good, because I was going to say.
Right. It's not like you can just ignore the elephant in the room. But what they suggest is that our free will, it exists within the framework of the divine plan. So it's not that our choices are predetermined, but rather that they have a ripple effect.
So even our mistakes, our wrong turns, they all feed into this larger process of Tikkun Olam.
That's the idea. And that brings us to another captivating piece of this deep dive. Yeshua's famous teaching, "You are the light of the world and the salt of the earth."
Try getting that image out of your head. Every time I hear those words, I get chills. But even though it's such a powerful statement, I'm not sure I totally grasp it. How does this source, with its Jewish perspective, interpret such a famous line?
This is where those Kabbalistic and Hasidic concepts we mentioned earlier come in.
Oh, boy.
Time to buckle up. Right, because we're not just talking about light as some flowery metaphor for, like, knowledge or being a good person. In Kabbalah, light represents divine energy, God's actual presence in the world.
Okay, that's already blowing my mind a little.
Right. So what the source is suggesting is that when Yeshua said, "You are the light of the world," he was saying that each of us has the potential to reflect that divine energy, to become a vessel for God's presence right here, right now.
So it's not just about being good. It's about becoming a conduit for something way, way bigger than ourselves.
You got it. And the source directly connects this to the mitzvot, the commandments.
Yeah.
It's about aligning our actions with a divine blueprint for how to live and be in this world, which in turn draws that divine energy into the world.
So it's like we become these little sparks of divinity illuminating the world around us through our actions.
Now you're getting it. And we haven't even touched on the salt of the earth part yet. That metaphor is just as multi-layered and mind-blowing, trust me.
Yeah. Oh, I believe you. But we're going to have to save that for part 2 because my brain is officially full. But trust me, listeners, you do not want to miss the rest of this deep dive. We're just getting started. You know, before we jump back in, I got to say, salt, as a metaphor, it's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind when I think deep spiritual teachings.
Right. You don't exactly picture like a salt shaker on the table at a mystical summit.
Exactly. But this source, it ties salt of the earth back to the covenant of salt, that Brit Malach we talked about earlier, remember? The one that was such a key part of temple offerings in ancient Israel.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It really is. So remind me again, why was salt such a big deal in temple offerings?
Okay, so way back in the day, salt was huge E, symbolically speaking. It represented purity, preservation, this unbreakable bond. And when it comes to temple offerings, no offering was complete without it. It was like this visible reminder of the everlasting covenant between God and the Jewish people.
Okay, yeah, that's starting to ring a bell. So it's more than just like salt makes things taste better, right? We're talking about a much deeper spiritual kind of flavor.
Exactly. And this source, they go even further, connecting salt to the Kabbalistic idea of gevura.
Gevura. Now that one rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
It's often translated as strength, sometimes even discipline or judgment. It's that energy of like tough love. It's strength that's needed to protect something precious, to keep it from falling apart.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So just like salt preserves food, gevura preserves the spiritual integrity of the world, keeps it from like dissolving into chaos.
You got it. It's about setting boundaries, holding things together. And when Yeshua calls his disciples the salt of the earth, he's calling on them to embody that energy of gevura, to be guardians of that covenant, those forces of strength and preservation in a world that's constantly trying to pull us away from the divine, you know?
Wow, okay, yeah, that puts a whole new spin on things.
Okay.
And suddenly, those bland little salt crystals are looking a lot more powerful.
Right. It's amazing how much depth there is to uncover just by shifting our perspective a little, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of shifting perspectives, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, or should I say, the Pharisee in the room.
Yeah, we can't just gloss over that. The Pharisees tend to get a bad rap, especially when it comes to their interactions with Yeshua.
It's like they're always portrayed as the villains, the sticklers for the rules, totally missing the point of Yeshua's message.
Right. But remember how we were talking about context being everything? Well, it's especially true here. To really understand the dynamic between Yeshua and the Pharisees, we have to remember who the Pharisees were, what they represented in that time and place.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but these weren't just like random guys on the street corner. These were the leading scholars, the keepers of Jewish law and tradition.
You got it. We're talking about the intellectual heavyweights of their time. They dedicated their lives to studying the Torah, debating its finer points, figuring out how to apply these ancient teachings to the everyday lives of the Jewish people.
So not exactly the two-dimensional bad guys that they're often made out to be.
Not even close. And this source, it goes out of its way to emphasize that. It argues that Yeshua's teachings were actually very much in line with Pharisaic thought, especially when you look at the core values, the emphasis on repentance, on actively living a life in accordance with the Torah.
Okay, so not just knowing the rules, but actually living them.
Exactly. And the source even quotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden, a major figure in Jewish scholarship. He argued that Yeshua actually strengthened Jewish commitment to the Torah and helped spread the idea of one God to the Gentile world.
Wow, that's a game changer. So we've gone from the Pharisees being Yeshua's enemies to them being like kindred spirits.
Yeah. They were both engaging with the same core ideas, just maybe approaching them from slightly different angles.
Yeah.
Which, honestly, isn't that different from how religious debates often play out even today, right?
Truer words have never been spoken. It's easy to focus on the differences, the points of contention, but often there's more common ground than we realize.
100%.
Yeah.
And when we can step back and see those commonalities, it opens the door for dialogue, for understanding, which honestly feels pretty important these days, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. So as we start to wrap our heads around this new, more nuanced perspective on Yeshua and the Pharisees, what's the main takeaway here for our listeners? What's the one thing we want them to remember?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that history is rarely black and white, good guys versus bad guys. There are always nuances, layers of complexity, especially when we're talking about religious figures and movements.
So it's about resisting those easy answers, those simplistic narratives that we often cling to.
Exactly. It's about being willing to dig a little deeper, to question our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility that the truth might be more complicated, more nuanced than we initially thought.
And that sometimes those complications, those nuances are where the most fascinating discoveries lie.
100%. It's like that quote by Albert Einstein. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.
Love it. And speaking of curiosity and questioning, I have a feeling this source material still has a few more surprises in store for us. Because we haven't even touched on it. Well, I guess you'll just have to tune in for part 3 to find out.
I do love a good cliffhanger.
You know, it's one thing to talk about historical context and everything, but I gotta be honest, this whole deep dive, it's really making me look at things differently, you know? Like, even on a personal level.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a shift in perspective can do that, right?
Yeah.
Make you question everything you thought you knew.
No, for real. And speaking of questioning things, remember how we were talking about Yeshua's teachings aligning with Pharisaic thought? I thought the source material got really specific about that, which I love.
Yeah, they didn't just brush over it. They gave some pretty concrete examples.
And I thought that was so helpful because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, their ideas were kind of similar, but to actually see those specific points of connection, it made it all click for me.
I totally agree. And one that really stood out to me was how the document highlighted Yeshua's emphasis on repentance, which, as we know, is a huge deal in Jewish tradition.
Right, like it's not just some side note, it's central.
Exactly. And the Pharisees, they called it teshuvah, this whole process of turning back to God, owning your mistakes, and trying to make things right. And according to the source, Yeshua echoed that same message, calling for that sincere change of heart, a true return to righteous living.
It's not just about saying you're sorry, it's about actually changing your ways, right?
100%. Actions speak louder than words, right? And the source argues that both Yeshua and the Pharisees were very much on the same page about that.
Which, again, just blows my mind because for so long I've had this image of them being at odds, constantly butting heads.
Oh, I know. It's like that image is so ingrained in our minds. But when you really dig into the history, it's so much more nuanced than that.
It really is. And, you know, we've been talking about shifting perspectives, and I think it's important to acknowledge that this whole discussion, this whole exploration of Yeshua's Jewish identity, it can be a sensitive topic for some people, you know?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of baggage there, a lot of history, and it's important to approach it all with sensitivity and respect.
To ever get this feeling like, history's messing with us. Like all those rivalries, those clashes we see, what if they're actually pushing towards the same endpoint without even realizing it? And get this, today we're applying that to how Jewish thought views Christianity.
Whoa, hold on. Before anyone thinks this is another my religion's better debate, it's not that at all. You sent these excerpts, Beit Yisrael International talks on Messiah, because you're curious how Jewish thinkers fit Christianity into the grand scheme, right? Not just the differences, but its role overall.
Hit the nail on the head. And the source material, right off the bat, surprised me. It says some Jewish sages actually see a purpose in Christianity's rise. Not that they agree with the teachings, but like it's acknowledged as part of a process.
It's a perspective that makes you think. And to really get it, we got to turn to a heavyweight in Jewish thought. Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides, Rambam, he's called, 12th century. But his stuff's still studied like it's brand new. Now, Rambam said something wild he suggests both Jesus and Muhammad, while teaching things that contradict Jewish belief, were in their own way preparing the world for the Messiah.
Okay, well, back up a second. Are we saying Rambam endorses these faiths then? Because that's going to throw some people for a loop.
Not even close. It's way more subtle than that. It's not about those figures being right or wrong, but that them appearing at all, spreading their ideas, however different from Judaism, played into something bigger, like God's plan unfolding on a historical scale. Unintended consequence, but part of a bigger design, you know?
I dig that, like a seed scattering on the wind lands somewhere you'd never expect, but it takes root.
Exactly. And the seed, according to Rambam, is the one God idea, monotheism. Easy to forget, but for Christianity, worshiping tons of gods was normal. Whatever else it taught, Christianity took that one God idea global. So many folks went from many deities to one, even if they understood that God differently than Judaism did.
So it's like Christianity accidentally prepped the world for that one God concept, even if everyone argues over what that God's like.
Right on. And Rambam's not alone here. Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, Rambam, he agreed this isn't some fringe thing. It's woven into Jewish thought for centuries, this back and forth.
This is where it gets really interesting for me, though. We've been talking about spreading this idea of one God, but, there's this huge thing we can't ignore.
Yeah.
All the tragic stuff, the persecution of Jewish people tied up with these religious differences. So if there's a purpose to Christianity taking off like it did,
Right.
is there a purpose to all the bad stuff that came along with it?
Man, that's a tough one. And it's not like Jewish thinkers have avoided it. This is where Tikkun Olam comes in, repairing the world. Some sages, they believe that suffering, awful as it is, it's part of something bigger. It's not about saying the pain's less, but like, why is suffering a thing at all,
So even in the really bad stuff, there might be meaning.
It's not that everything happens for a reason, exactly. More like searching for why, for something good in the dark. The source mentions the Vilna Gaon, big 18th century scholar. He wrestled with this too, suffering. And he landed on it, being part of a journey to something better.
Kind of like, we may never get why the bad stuff happens, but there's a bigger picture we're just a part of.
Exactly. And that leads to what might sound craziest of all, this idea of the Messianic age, where everyone, everywhere, recognizes God as one.
Okay, but come on, our world, divided over everything. Everyone knowing God like that feels impossible.
I get it. It seems that way now. But this hope, it's not some new idea. Deep, deep roots in Jewish thought.
Where's it come from then?
Zohar, for one. Mystical text, Kabbalah. Then the Hasidic leaders, they were big on this Messianic age. Messiah comes, everything's clear, confusion's gone. All nations, they just see it, one God.
Wow. That's some image. Anything in the source itself that gets at that.
There's an Isaiah quote. Nations shall walk in your light, it says, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Like, picture it world bathed in this light of understanding, everyone together, recognizing what's divine.
Beautiful, I gotta admit. But let's be real a sec. We're still kind of dodging the hard part. Christianity had a role, suffering has a purpose, but all the terrible stuff done in religion's name, are we saying those acts, they're in the plan too?
Yeah, that's where it gets real messy, even disturbing.
Because if everything, even the awful stuff, is God's plan, doesn't that make it okay?
Right. Tough question. And the source doesn't shy away. It says even mistaken beliefs, bad calls, they're somehow in this plan of God's.
So, not that the bad things were good,
Right.
but they happened, and even that's part of something we can't fully get.
You got it. Uses Isaiah again to show how different our understanding is from God's. My thoughts are not your thoughts, God says. Neither your ways, my ways.
Makes you feel kind of small, huh? Like we can't grasp it all, this plan.
Right. It's about accepting there's mystery, even when it's really tough. But within that, the idea that mistakes, suffering, it can be like refining us.
Refining. Pain makes us better, that kind of thing.
It's a hard one to wrap your head around, no doubt.
So we're talking about like spiritual alchemy or something. Suffering in a way we barely get turns into, I don't know, something purer.
Rabbi Cook, 20th century, really nailed this. He said suffering's like a crucible. Fire burns away the bad stuff, leaves what's strong, spiritually. Not about liking pain, but it having the potential to make something better within us.
Out of the ashes kind of thing.
Yeah. Out of the ashes comes something new. Who knew, right? And that brings us back around. Started with everyone getting on the same page about God.
It's a lot, for sure. But you're right. It's not just some thought experiment. This stuff changes how we are in the world day to day.
It does.
So last thought here. If even these totally opposed forces, even the bad stuff, it's part of something bigger, how should that change how we act towards people whose beliefs are different, even the ones we really disagree with?
Makes you look deeper, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of just they're wrong, it's like, maybe they're part of this story we don't see yet. Hard to do, holding that thought, but important.
Really makes you think. If these Jewish thinkers can say Christianity plays a part in getting us to this Messianic age, Maybe it changes how we treat anyone different from us. Not just religion, but politics, how we see the world. Something to chew on, right? Totally. And as we're coming to the end of this deep dive, I'm just feeling so much awe, honestly. Like we've just scratched the surface here, but it's opened up a whole new world for me.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's always more to discover, more to learn. And I think if our listeners take away anything from this, it's that sense of curiosity, that willingness to dig deeper.
100%. To question everything, to be open to new perspectives, to embrace the mystery of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this incredible deep dive. To our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the Jewish identity of Yeshua. Keep those minds curious and keep exploring. Until next time.